Now, in the second half of the 20th century, the US, on anyone's measure, has been claimed to be a remarkable engine of innovation, invention and economic growth. And it'd be wise for us to reflect on what has made that American miracle, and what systematic forces were at play, and what forces were merely incidental. One of the remarkable features of the US system, compared with other developed economies, has been the dominance of the defence industry. Since World War II, defence has constituted over 50% of the central government's R&D spend. And as Professor Mowery has shown in his many studies on this area, the peculiarity of the American defence model is not just simply earmarking budgets for the military. Its special features include the preference for quality over cost, use of capital funding that played the long game, the engineering of knowledge diffusion and technology sharing, extensive use of procurement to support innovative new products and startups, and its mission-driven focus. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor David Mowery, who's Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He's authored to over 100 articles on the economics of innovation and is one of the foremost experts in national innovation systems. Professor Mowery's knowledge extends well beyond the military and innovation, but also includes the translation of research from universities to industry, the market for technology, and industrial leadership. In addition to his university appointments, which also include Harvard and Carnegie Mellon, Professor Mowery has been an expert advisor to many technology, aviation and innovation panels for the National Academy of Sciences, the United States government, large industrial firms and the OECD. He's been the recipient of numerous academic awards, including the Richard D. Irwin Outstanding Educator Award and the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Academy of Management, the Raymond Vernon Prize from the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, the Economic Histories Association Fritz Redlich Prize, and the Business History Review's Newcomen Prize. So it's with a great pleasure for me to have Professor Mowery here to speak to you tonight, and can you please make him welcome?
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, and it's a great pleasure to be here to present some remarks on defense R&D and the development of new industries in the post-war US economy. Obviously, this is an issue that has bounced around in policy debates for decades. The role of government in supporting economic change and creating the conditions for prosperity in domestic economies. And I think the defense R&D story in the United States is interesting, partly, or the way that I choose to approach it is to try to tease out those elements that I think may give us guidance in pursuing public support for innovation in other fields. I recognize, however, that in many respects, the US situation is sui generis, both in terms of scale, the duration of very large investments, and the close relationship between investment in innovation and procurement. And I'll try to elaborate on this. I guess the other anomalous or surprising element that I will also emphasize is the conjunction of policies undertaken, as it were, within the defense innovation space and policies elsewhere in the universe of US domestic economic policy, particularly competition policy and intellectual property rights policy. And I think it's easy to imagine that there was a conscious strategy of linking and coordinating these developments in what are very much separate areas of policy. I'm quite skeptical of that view, in fact. Nevertheless, the conjunction of these developments in these different elements of policy, I think, contributed considerably to the impact of defense R&D investment by the federal government. I'll try to elaborate on that as we go along. Okay, well, we're going backwards rather than forwards. Let's see if I can, no, okay. Here we go. So really there are three broad questions that I'm going to try to address here. First of all is this reference to US, and particularly post-war US, defense-related R&D as an important source of high-tech innovation and the development of new industries. And there's a question of how we interpret this as we look back on the historical record. Is this an example, as some have suggested, of the successful operation of the federal government acting as a venture capitalist, effectively with a strategic sense of investing in high opportunity areas and supporting those areas in such a way as to generate new industries and economic growth? A second issue, as I look back, is looking forward. How is the future outlook for defense-related R&D and civilian innovation likely to change, if at all? I think there is reason to think that it might. And thirdly, if we focus on the components of this complicated history and web of policies, are there elements we can tease out, conclusions we can draw, speculations about elements of successful innovation in other areas? For example, climate change, but the list is long, public health challenges and the like. So these are three things that I hope to at least touch on in my remarks, and we can discuss that obviously in the Q&A. So the first, and I think by far the most important element of the post-1945 investment by the federal government in defense-related R&D is the sheer size of that investment. We're talking in constant dollar terms about $3 trillion spanning the period from 1949 to 2017. So over nearly 60 years, an enormous investment, obviously outstripping that of any other economy. And as was suggested earlier, defense-related R&D has consistently accounted for more than 50% of federal government investment in R&D throughout this period. And indeed, this share, defense-related R&D share in total federal R&D investment during the early 50s was upwards of 80% in as the Cold War buildup under the pressure of the Korean conflict and the like rolled out. But no less important, I think, in evaluating the effects of this very large R&D investment is the even larger investment by the U.S. Defense Department and military services in procurement, in purchasing the results of this R&D. And if one looks at those numbers, the cumulative investment by Department of Defense over a shorter period of time, 50 plus years, 1962 to 2017, is nearly twice as large as the cumulative investment in R&D. And I want to try to convince you that if we're thinking about the effects of that R&D investment, we really need to think about the effects of the joint investment in research and development on the one hand and procurement on the other. And I think that, in my view, that does have implications for similar initiatives to meet societal grand challenges in other areas. This is just showing you the share of total federal R&D spending accounted for by the Department of Defense. You can, as I say, you can see the 80% period in the early years, and it comes down, a big bump up with the Reagan administration defense buildup, and then it trends down around, but consistently slightly above 50% over the ensuing many years, and remains at about 52% in the most current federal budget. Here we've got procurement spending in yellow on this graph, and this is just, again, trying to graphically convince you that much more is spent on procurement. And obviously this is procurement across the board. This is nuts, bolts, tires, cars, as well as the products resulting from defense R&D contracts. So it's not terribly surprising that it's so much larger, but as I will hopefully emphasize over and over again, it's very difficult to conceptualize and understand the effects of the R&D investment without thinking about the procurement. So how does mission-oriented R&D of the sort that Dr. Spurling referred to and that is exemplified classically by defense R&D investment, how does this investment affect sort of the innovation landscape within an industrial economy such as that of the United States? A very important component, and again, this was anticipated in Dr. Spurling's remarks, of the defense-related R&D investment by the US federal government was that much of it went into developing an R&D infrastructure, a research infrastructure, if you will, an institutional infrastructure encompassing standalone government labs, which I think were cited on some of his, Dr. Spurling's earlier work, as well as universities, very importantly, industry, and also as part of this, an investment in the training of the scientists and engineers who would, in subsequent years, enter into the conduct of this R&D. So R&D infrastructure and training of the human capital, creation of the human capital to perform this research, very important. A second, which I think is easy to overstate, is the so-called pure knowledge spillovers. This is when the results of a piece of research are published, are made available and widely disseminated through publication, primarily conference presentations and the like. And obviously this spills over and can be accessed at, depending on who you talk to, relatively low cost, or at least without having to pay a great many attorneys and agents in order to gain access to it. But in defense-related R&D, as in some other areas of mission-oriented research, the pure basic component, the basic research component of this investment accounts for a relatively small share, about 25%. That's where we usually look to see the most fertile source of these spillovers, and it's a relatively small share. Another important contributor flowing from defense R&D to civilian innovation are the so-called spin-offs. This is the development of technical advances that have applications in civilian innovations as well as in defense applications. And this obviously, the availability, the creation of these spin-offs, their exploitation revolves around the availability of expertise within would-be civilian innovators, very important obviously, but also similarities between the defense applications and those to which the civilian firms hope to apply this. And this is an ongoing tension, if you will, within the spin-off phenomenon in post-war US defense R&D. Procurement, very important, as I said, and I will continue to say, in affecting both the exploitation of defense-related R&D advances and also in affecting the very structure of the industries that grow around the exploitation of these spin-offs. In effect, historically in the post-war United States, the military was a lead user, willing to pay a premium price for technical advances that met its demanding requirements for application in peculiar environments of all sorts. Over time, in many cases, these early purchases, often at premium prices, enable civilian suppliers to exploit learning economies, lower their production costs, improve the quality and reliability and breadth of application of those technologies, enabling them to penetrate civilian markets. So the procurement side is extremely important to think of. So what I'm going to talk about in particular now is these, what I refer to as new industries that emerge in the basically the post-1950 US economy in information technology. We've got semiconductors, microelectronics, computer hardware, and computer software. All three of them emerged really over the course of the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s, and in turn more or less come together. The results, the technologies that existed in these three areas come together to spawn the internet. And coming back to my favorite theme, obviously R&D investment and procurement were important influences on the development of these industries, but, and this is where the policies in other spheres play an important role in both competition policy and intellectual property rights policy as they developed, keeping in mind that these were particularly important influences on new industries. You're talking about policy influencing industries at their most embryonic state. And arguably, as with people, if you exercise a certain, create a certain environment, it can have long-term effects on the evolution of an industry, a person, you name it. And I think that in understanding the effects of R&D investment and procurement, you need to keep these developments in these other spheres in mind, even as I claim that these developments in these other spheres advance without very much overt coordination with defense-related R&D investment. So let me talk in about 3 slides about a long history of the development of semiconductor technology in the United States. And this is a technology that was really led by industry. Transistor, the seminal innovation in semiconductors, as well as its follow-on seminal innovation, the integrated circuit. But particularly the transistor was developed by Bell Labs, the research arm of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, the effective domestic monopolist in telecom service at this time in the United States, within their self-financed R&D program. And indeed, industry-based knowledge of the science as well as the engineering aspects of semiconductor technology substantially outstripped that of academia through the 50s and early 1960s, to the point where a newly hired electrical engineering professor at Stanford University, brand new assistant professor, was essentially volunteered by his department chair, and actually I think by the Dean of Engineering as well. This was James Gibbons. He was sent off to work at Shockley Semiconductor, which was down the street in Palo Alto, to learn semiconductor technology at the feet of the people who were manufacturing it, because you really couldn't go to a laboratory or a research institute at this time to gain this kind of deep knowledge of semiconductor technology. Gibbons later became the Dean of Engineering, of course, at Stanford. And, so something clearly rubbed off. Gibbons was a very nice fellow. Shockley, the founder and CEO of Shockley Semiconductor, was anything but that's a separate story. Actually, the fact that Shockley's managerial incompetence was an important factor on the growth of the semiconductor industry in the San Francisco Bay Area, precisely because Shockley repelled so many of his most competent employees to go off and start firms of their own. But that's another example of something that more or less occurred alongside defense R&D investment, was not coordinated, that I know of anyway. So what did AT&T do with the transistor technology that they had developed and in varying degrees had patented? They were under pressure from the US government, which had filed an antitrust suit, a competition policy lawsuit against them. And as a result, they adopted a relatively open kimono approach to managing their intellectual property. This extended to AT&T both circulating a handbook of semiconductor technology, process and product technology that became a Bible within the industry, and also the sponsorship of seminars to disseminate know-how. Furthermore, when this antitrust suit settled, the attorneys agreed to stop suing each other in 1956. One of the provisions of that agreement was that AT&T would license its semiconductor patents liberally, and that AT&T, in exchange for licensing you, would ask you to license them. So it was a bilateral exchange of know-how, and this grew up to be a widespread policy within the embryonic semiconductor industry. So every new firm, as well as AT&T, had cross licenses with everyone else. So again, the formal intellectual property is disseminating widely among the firms in the early industry. By the late 1950s, federal funding, almost all of which was defense-related, accounted for about 25% of industry R&D investments, so public plus private R&D investment. And about 50%, and the federal government accounted for about 50% of sales. But interestingly, while the established semiconductor producers, the AT&Ts, General Electrics, and others, RCA, dominated the R&D contracts. New firms that had been founded less than 10 years earlier, dominated the sales of products to the federal government, which again was largely the Defense Department. So new firms' share of semiconductor sales greatly exceeded their share of federal R&D contracts. And the procurement policies developed to manage purchase of this brand new technology, often unreliable technology, difficult to manufacture technology. These procurement contracts further promoted inter-firm technology exchange, because in order to sell to the Defense Department as an individual vendor, you had to license and get up to speed another source, a so-called second source for semiconductor-related products, in order that the federal government would have a backup if you suddenly proved unable to manufacture these products. So the second sourcing requirements really accelerated inter-firm technology exchange, and also the emerging structure of these new firms that entered, attracted by lucrative procurement contracts, differed greatly from the structure of the established firms, and also differed greatly from the structure of firms who were entering this brand new industry in Western Europe and in Japan. These were the so-called merchant producers, specialized in the production of semiconductor components, not producing electronic systems, unlike the Toshibas or the Siemenses of the world, operating in very different markets. So you have a very unusual set of influences producing an industry structure that differed greatly with what we see elsewhere at the same time. And you have this rapid exchange of technology among firms. This is just showing the gradual decline in federal purchases, again, DoD dominated, Defense Department dominated, of semiconductor products over the course of the 60s and 70s, as these new semiconductor producers penetrated civilian markets and enjoyed rapid growth in these markets. So this is the classic lead purchaser driving these firms down their learning curves, and widespread adoption of the technology occurs within the civilian economy. So if we just trying to summarize this rather hasty overview, R&D funding clearly played an important role coming from the Defense Department, but procurement was extremely important as well in influencing the growth, particularly of spin-off applications. Antitrust policy and procurement policy worked to both reduce entry barriers, that is to say it was easier to enter this brand new industry because procurement contracts offered a very tempting prize, if you will, and did not require extensive previous experience in manufacturing. And also, through the effects of this lawsuit settled in 1956 on AT&T's behavior, one can imagine the world without that lawsuit. If AT&T had indeed retained all of its prodigious knowledge and know-how about this technology, the world probably would have looked very different. We would have probably seen a semiconductor industry dominated by a large producer to an extent we did not see in reality. But the other important point, and this is sort of jumping ahead 30 years or so, is that this is a spin-off story, in my view, of defense-developed applications, technologies finding applications in civilian markets. And what we see over time is that as the applications environments for the defense uses of microelectronics and the civilian uses of microelectronics diverge substantially, this kind of spin-off potential declines dramatically. And indeed, as civilian markets dominate the semiconductor industry, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, becomes very concerned about trying to sort of attract technical talent and firms back into the development of new technologies for defense applications. This was the motivation behind the so-called very high-speed integrated circuit program, defense-sponsored in the 1980s and 1990s, which largely failed because they were not able to bring in the civilian firms and talent that they hoped to. So here, and as I will try to argue, in other of these IT industries, this spin-off potential seems to decline over time because the worlds of defense and non-defense applications tend to diverge. Let me go on to talk equally hastily about the development of computer hardware, which is an interesting and contrasting story to some extent, because military funding of computer development in the United States largely received an enormous impetus during World War II because of the concerns of the uniformed services with developing ballistics calculations and code-breaking technologies. And the lead developers, the institutions most heavily involved with defense-related funding, were universities. So you had large programs at Harvard and an even larger, more successful program that emerged at the University of Pennsylvania, the so-called ENIAC program, funded largely by the federal government. And they began to produce significant advances in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So federal spending plays a very important role in the R&D and over time in the procurement of the results of this R&D in the form of computers. But here too, as this technology finds non-defense applications, both the R&D funding and the markets provided by the Defense Department for computers declines as a share. But the DoD also played a major role in the development of the so-called research infrastructure for this, again, embryonic industry, embryonic scientific discipline of computer science, funding along with the National Science Foundation. The establishment of new computer science departments at U.S. universities, in many cases that funding consisted of buying a mainframe computer for them, and we see the number of computer science departments really expand dramatically from the 60s into the 1990s. And this played a very important role both in seeding the development of academic research capability, but also seeding the growth of industry-based expertise as the people trained in these programs moved into industrial employment. And again, another somewhat fortuitous contrast between defense-supported R&D in the US computer industry and those supported elsewhere, particularly the Soviet Union and even Great Britain, is that the US program was to a surprising degree relatively open to non-defense researchers and academic researchers. And so here too you have a seminar sponsored in part by the Defense Department taking place at the University of Pennsylvania in the summer of 1946, really devoted to techniques of computer engineering and development, played a very important role in disseminating this technology within the US research community and also elsewhere. Early UK computer scientists attended this, and their research expertise was considerably enhanced. We see a much more classified, walled-off program operating within both the Soviet Union, which is probably not too surprising, and Great Britain, where a very early, pioneering code-breaking computer, the so-called Colossus, developed as part of the Bletchley Park code-breaking initiative, was physically destroyed at the end of 1945 because of concerns over the technology leaking out. So very, very different approaches, and I think again, you see the effects of this more open approach having significant effects on the civilian industry's development. Military procurement, again, directed heavily toward new firms in the emergent computer hardware industry, and another antitrust suit, which was filed against IBM, settled in 1956, the same year as the AT&T suit was settled. And like that suit, the settlement decree mandated licensing by IBM, then one of the dominant sources of expertise, partly because of their involvement in a very large air defense computer hardware development program, which was managed by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. MIT developed a substantial patent portfolio, which under the terms of this antitrust decree, settlement decree, were licensed broadly. Again, we see the federal share of industry sales declining over time, although remaining significant in high-end computers. So again, you're seeing, as in semiconductors, except for very unique defense-specific applications, the federal presence as a market declining substantially over time. So here too, I think you see the spin-off model working, albeit the model to some extent and that influence declining over time. Nevertheless, here too you see competition policy and closely related intellectual property rights policy promoting the kind of exchange of technology and know-how within the industry that played an important role in its development. The research infrastructure, supported in large part by the Defense Department, in turn supported the growth of industry expertise within industry and the development of a strong research capability within academia. And further and beyond the defense sphere, federal procurement policy through the 60s and 70s actively discriminated against IBM as the dominant supplier in purchases of computer hardware for federal non-defense applications. So you see again a potentially dominant firm at least being to some extent restrained by this combination of policies developed outside of the defense R&D sphere. Computer software, again, a similar story. This air defense development project managed by MIT, employing IBM as its primary contractor, became a very important school for training individuals in what was then the black art of software development and coding. So this was the so-called, the acronym SAGE, Semi-Automated Ground Environment, don't ask me why, which was basically a large computer network linking radar stations that were directed to detecting incoming bombing raids from the Soviet Union. That program, which was later spun off by MIT to the RAND Corporation and subsequently became the Systems Development Corporation, was an important training school and trade school for software developers. And hardware development by the Defense Department played an important influence in the development of what then were widely used software languages, so-called COBOL, Common Business-Oriented Language, was developed during the late 1950s under the influence of DoD funding. Here too, antitrust and procurement policy played an important role in the development of this embryonic industry as the IBM Corporation is forced to separate its pricing of software and hardware, another antitrust suit, and as Washington, D.C. became a hotbed for federal agencies purchasing software from new firms, non-IBM suppliers. And over time, and this story is relatively well known, and probably the primary novel aspect of it for my focus here is the extent to which the Defense Department recedes as an important influence. Over time, what we see is several pioneering architectures in the mainframe space. Mainframe architectures, the System 360 by IBM provides a large, the 360 and the 650 provide a large standardized hardware platform that further enticed independent developers of software applications and operating systems to meet the demands of this large, rapidly growing market. And that the subsequent emergence of the personal computer creates an even larger standardized market for the entry of producers of standard and so-called shrink-wrap software. And obviously, as this market grew, the non-defense market grew. It dwarfed the size of the defense market. Academic computer science investments long ago by the Defense Department are an important input to the developing software industry. And again, formal intellectual property rights remain fairly weak in this industry until a series of decisions by the federal courts recognize the importance and validity of patents, formal patent protection in software. Finally, we have another sort of last gasp of the spin-off model under the, as the federal government, as the Defense Department tries to, shades of VHSIC, attract commercial or developers of commercial software back into the defense market. This was the so-called ADA software initiative, which purported to be support the development of a standardized suite of software that would cover all defense applications. Again, it largely failed. Sharp contrast with what we see in the earlier development of COBOL, where the Defense Department was such an important presence in the market. Moving on, the internet. So we have these three emergent industries, hardware, software, transistors, or semiconductors, coming together. And the internet is kind of builds on all three of them, but here too, DoD played an important, and I would argue, a catalytic role, and a role not dissimilar from what it has played in these other segments. New firms, major beneficiaries of Defense Department funded R&D and procurement contracts, promotion of both civil and military applications through these R&D and other contracts, and the exploitation of the academic research infrastructure that had been spawned by this R&D. The US was not necessarily a standalone pioneer in the development of the computer networking technology that underpinned the emergence of the internet. And indeed, France and the UK both had very important and very technically sophisticated programs operating in this area that did register important advances. But what led the US to dominate the early internet in particular was the fact that the US provided such a large market, civilian market, for the rollout of the internet. And in turn, this large space, wide deployment of the internet provides a playground for innovators from all backgrounds. You know, people sitting on their beds at home, academics, sophisticated users, and you see a cascade of innovations coming in many cases from sophisticated users of this emerging technology. Again, we have an approach to intellectual property rights that tends to weaken their significance, where you have the key protocol placed in the public domain rather than being patented, and the internet effectively bypassed the infrastructure of the otherwise dominant telecom firm AT&T, whose influence was further reduced by yet another antitrust suit and the 1982 settlement of that suit. Let me turn briefly, in an effort to stop talking just about successes and imposing this retrospective bias, on other areas where the U.S. Defense Department was a major funder of R&D and procurement, and where the track record is much more mixed. in jet-powered commercial aircraft, we really have a classic spin-off story. And again, a story where the key technologies that underpinned jet-powered commercial aircraft, the jet engine and the swept wing airframe, both were based on R&D and technical advances undertaken outside the United States. German aerodynamics research underpinned the swept wing airframe. The British really pioneered the development of the jet engine, and the US effectively expropriated it during World War II. Nevertheless, what you have is a strong commonality in applications between jet-powered commercial aircraft and what was under development by the Boeing Corporation as a jet-powered air tanker. The air tanker technology underpinned much of the architecture of the Boeing 707. And here too, the story is one of decline over time in this cross-fertilization, or the direction, I should say, of cross-fertilization between military and civil applications, to the extent that subsequent generations of air tankers, jet-powered air tankers, effectively draw on civilian airframe and engine technology. So the follow-on to the early Boeing air tanker was based on the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 airframe, and its successor was based on the Boeing 767 airframe. So the flow of architectural knowledge, at least, was effectively reversed. Nuclear power is a very interesting story, I think, with a lot of lessons, because it's a good example of a very aggressive promotional policy undertaken by the federal agency, which was effectively the federal agency in charge of nuclear bomb development, the Atomic Energy Commission. They were very interested in promoting peaceful uses for atomic power, and aggressively promoted civilian application of a military nuclear reactor designed to fit inside a submarine hull that turned out not to be terribly well suited to civilian applications, to the extent that effectively the market in civilian nuclear power generators for electric power generation in the US largely had collapsed by the 1970s. And this is, I think, a cautionary tale of promotion of a single design, failure to consider a broader set of alternatives, and also promotion of a single design to an industry, the electrical utility industry in the United States, where industry expertise was very limited. Their ability to understand the cost, benefits, trade-offs, and particularly the likely cost overruns, very limited, and really had a chilling effect on the adoption and dissemination of this technology in the United States. So a very different story there, although the development, again, entirely Defense Department funded. Computer numerically controlled machine tools, again, this was largely developed at laboratories at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, sponsored by the US Air Force in particular, to develop machine tools that could be used in the production of advanced aircraft, high-tech, high-performance aircraft. A successful development project produced a technology that was adopted exclusively by producers of military aircraft and failed to find much of any application outside of that sort of elite sphere. You didn't see any of the kinds of spin-offs operating there that you saw in these other IT-related areas. I think this is still not as well understood as I would like, but obviously I think it has a great deal to do with a failure to seed or support the kind of research infrastructure and training of people who could adopt these technologies and find civilian applications in new and more successful spheres. So, I'm wrapping up over several slides now. Conclusions. I think in thinking about why defense-related R&D was important in this IT sector, why it seems to have played such an important role in growing these new industries. Obviously, the scale was very important, but the structure equally important. But the scale itself was extremely important because you could support through programs of this magnitude, within this $3 trillion total investment, a lot of competition among would-be research performers, would-be suppliers of the technology, and in various ways adopters of the technology. So the scale is important, and I think that's an area in which the US programs contrasted with many Western European ones, where you had a single supplier in many cases playing a dominant role both in performing the R&D and developing the technology. So it's hard to disentangle these two. Obviously, because the R&D support extended beyond mere support for R&D, it had the effect of encouraging these inter-firm technology flows that were very important, and the support for the growth of the R&D infrastructure, academic and industrial, created a more informed body of expertise and people within the adopting industries. And I think this was an important element of contrast between the IT and probably the commercial aircraft and the atomic power and CNC stories. Procurement obviously played a very important role, as I have hammered on for a while, both in enabling new firms to enter and in enabling them to penetrate civilian markets. Weak IPRs and antitrust policy, both promoting competition, in my view, that aided and abetted the kinds of competitive development of new technologies for both the civilian and defense-related markets. And a common element in much of this story as well is the decline of the spin-off mechanism, if you will, as an important channel through which the results of defense-related R&D investment could support innovation in the civilian technologies. And we saw this in IT, and I definitely see it in aircraft. The future, always a hazardous topic for prediction. Nevertheless, I think we see in many areas, not all, but many areas, that these kind of spin-off related knowledge flows and architectural innovations no longer flow from defense to civilian applications, but now operate in reverse. This very recent controversy over the award of a contract for advanced cloud software has singled out either Amazon or Microsoft as the recipient of the contract, both firms with little, if any, historic involvement in the development of software for defense applications. The US defense sector also has become much more concentrated. I mean, far fewer firms now dominate the defense sector. So I think the ability to support the kind of competition among firms in developing new technologies and applying them arguably is declining. Also, and related, the spiraling costs of new weapon systems in areas like aircraft or warships or ground-based vehicles had really almost gone out of sight. And this has obviously several effects. You're buying fewer units, fewer copies of a new product, but also it's more difficult to launch a lot of development projects. So the people who work on these things as R&D and development engineers have fewer chances to be educated in very advanced development projects just because the budget to support these things is under greater pressure. And this in turn tends to degrade the learning that's going on. And older generations have gone through many more of these projects, younger generations much less, and this has longer term implications. Also, there are issues in terms of the size and composition of the pool of technical expertise operating in the defense sector, closely related to growing security class restrictions on participation by non-citizens in many of these areas of advanced technology. So what can we say about the government as venture capitalist story here? I think it has severe limitations, most notably because the defense R&D investment story is one of the Defense Department the government, if you will, developing new technology for its own mission and markets. And as a result, this contrasts sharply with the situation of venture capitalists who seek at least to develop technologies for application in civilian, much more diverse markets. They don't exercise comparable control over the applications of their developments. Obviously, there's a risk as well in promoting demand for defense-related technologies, and these spectacularly failed in the case of nuclear power and the CNC machine tools area. And in thinking about the government as venture capitalist, you can't overlook the importance of these policies in other areas that ultimately complemented the objectives and the competitive environment for the performance of the R&D for defense purposes. Finally, a punchline. Lessons for climate change R&D. And this is obviously, this is more speculative than informed in many ways. But I think there are a few points that are critically important. The first is just the baseline. How important is R&D for climate change solutions? Well, it's clearly critical, and at the same time, the timeline during which some solutions at least need to be both developed and deployed broadly is such that for much of the, within the 20-year time frame that is highly relevant, we're talking about deploying improved versions of existing technologies. And that has add-on effects of its own because, as in the IT area, widespread deployment promotes learning in use, promotes improvement in the performance of these technologies, promotes various types of innovation. So that, clearly one of the indispensable implications here for climate change R&D is don't worry so much about R&D, worry much more about promoting deployment of advanced versions of existing technologies, capturing the learning and feeding that into subsequent generations. And that obviously has another couple of implications. One is deployment of existing technologies in the nature of the case is likely to rely heavily on private as well as public capital, and it's going to rely heavily on demand signals created by things like a carbon tax, like cap and trade. You really have to worry heavily about the demand side in order to promote this kind of accelerated adoption of improved versions of existing technology, partly in the hope of encouraging more rapid improvement. And as a result, I think this is really where the rubber meets the road, keeping in mind that promotion of individual design solutions is a very risky undertaking. But finally, there is a crucial role for R&D, but it really needs to focus on a much more diverse array of technologies and approaches than anything like the Defense Department was seeking to undertake, even in the darkest days of the Cold War, in countering what they saw as a strategic threat primarily from the Soviet Union, but now from a much broader array of players. So it's very important to diversify this portfolio at the same time as expanding it, but I think it's crucial not to overlook the role and the importance of adoption as we sit here right now, and that brings us into the very sticky politics of the demand side. So with that, I will conclude. I appreciate your attention, and I'll turn it over to Linda. Thank you.
Professor Linda Weiss is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences and Professor Emeritus in Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, and she's also Honorary Professor of Political Science at Haas University. She's lectured in North America, Europe and East Asia, and has held visiting appointments in France, the UK, Italy and Korea. Her specialisation is the comparative and international politics of economic development. She's published widely on globalisation and state power, developmental states and trade policies. In her latest book, America Inc., innovation and enterprise in the national security state, she examines the political economy of national security in the period spanning the Cold War to the present. Professor Weiss, would you please come up and
certainly
discuss
Thank you.
Professor Mowery's talk? Thank you very much.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here, not least because I can acknowledge in person the influence that Professor Mowery's work has had on my own research. So before I turn to David's work, a few words about that, because it does connect with his argument, part of it. Because it was an observation that David and his collaborator Nathan Rosenberg made in a paper back in 1982 that led me on a quest for an answer to the question, why was it the United States and not some other country or countries that rose to become the world's high-tech hegemon after World War II? And the observation that they made was that prior to World War II, US firms were mostly noted for their ability to adapt or improve upon innovations that had been pioneered elsewhere. They were really pioneers. And yet in the period after World War II, as we heard, the US was pushing out all manner of revolutionary innovations, semiconductors, computers and software, communication satellites, GPS, biotech, and the internet, and so on. So why the US? What changed? My own research led me to conclude that none of America's prowess in transformative innovation could be laid at the feet of industrial policy, as that's something that I had initially supposed. But nor was it simply the product of a free market economy, as the more conventional story goes. The key driver behind all of this radical, general purpose innovation was a perceived geopolitical threat. A threat to US national security, and most importantly, a persistent threat that emanated from a well-matched adversary, Soviet Russia, of course. And so to deal with that threat, the Pentagon frames this geostrategic imperative as the need to offset the quantitative advantages of the Soviets, larger numbers of men and of material, with the qualitative advantages of superior technology. And so it was then, of course, Russia's world-first launch of Sputnik in 1957 that became a key moment in cementing this techno-supremacy strategy. It intensified fears about the Soviet missile program and sparked a panic about America's innovation gap, which spearheaded federal investments in science and technology, created new technology-focused organisations like DARPA and NASA, both imbued with a national security mission, and established a modern venture capital industry. The point being that from Sputnik onwards, techno-supremacy becomes America's overarching national security project. It becomes the focus of US strategy for sustaining military primacy. Of course, the Cold War ends, and as the US gets embroiled in asymmetric conflicts in the Middle East, fighting much smaller adversaries, that tightly focused techno-strategy seems to go into limbo, and it kind of dovetails a bit with what David was saying. And with some exceptions, the military's big breakthrough projects of yesteryear take a back seat. But the end of the Cold War, I want to say, is not the end of the transformative innovation story, and I'll come back to that later. But first, coming back to David's work, what we find here is a landmark account of how the US defence sector has contributed to major technological breakthroughs. And you've heard the detailed story there, stories in 3 major industries, notably computers, software and semiconductors, all general purpose innovations that have generated new industries and underpinned US commercial strength. Now, his work has important things to say about the critical role of defence-related R&D funding, and especially procurement, in providing the government market for innovations that do not yet exist. I've learnt a lot from his work. And it makes sense to ask the question, it's not actually at the centre of this event, but it's sort of dangling there. How well placed is the defence sector to help drive the energy transition, the transformative innovation that climate change demands? Well, David's 2012 study, the one that was suggested to me to have a look at, to think about saying something today of relevance, concludes that in spite of its hefty transformative role in the past, we shouldn't pin our hopes on that source, chiefly because the defence sector is now only a marginal player in the innovation game. Its influence over the direction of technology is much diminished, since most innovation now occurs in the commercial sector. That's his argument. And it's a view that's by no means controversial, especially since the growth of the so-called digital economy, algorithmic economy, software economy, IT. I call it the FIG economy, represented by Facebook, iPhone and Google, where commercial innovations have grown most rapidly. But David's making a different point, which is to say that at least two key conditions, not the only ones, but two key conditions, that once favoured defence's catalytic role in technological innovation have changed. The major ones being, first, defence R&D spending is now much less when compared to the private sector spending. And second, defence's large procurement market now pales in comparison with the size of the commercial market. Both have served as important incentives to attract private firms to work with government on their projects, defence-related projects not only. So it's reasonable to conclude that their contraction reduces the leverage that defence can exercise over the direction of technology, and as a result limits its capacity for transformative innovation. Not least, climate change innovation. And that seems to me the centrepiece of his argument. And the first thing to say is that I agree with its premise. There's no question that changes to defence spending and buying power have occurred, and that these structural changes do exert an impact on the defence sector. But I'm not convinced that this is the end of the story of defence as an innovation catalyst, or that these changes, these ones to defence R&D spending and procurement, are the most important barriers to the military role in transformative innovation. So just to give my doubts some flesh, very briefly, I'll throw out three sets of comments. My first set of comments highlights problems with drawing conclusions from shifts in R&D spending. And here I see two problems. One being that the quantity of spending tells you nothing about the different kinds of innovation that prevail in each sector. And I've argued that at length in my book. For example, there's overwhelming evidence from virtually all high-tech sectors over several decades to show that the great majority of companies channel R&D funds to existing technologies and to incremental innovation, slight product improvements, rather than aiming for breakthrough innovations that create new markets. Given the importance of the bottom line and shareholder value, most corporate research budgets are devoted to innovations critical to maintaining companies' competitiveness in their existing industries. Private companies are generally not noted for pursuing radical innovation. And here's the contrast. The national security agencies have a risk appetite that is fundamentally different from that of the private sector. Their focus is on obtaining qualitative superiority vis-à-vis rivals. That makes them value performance, as David indicated to us, above all other goals, and they will generally accept very high costs to achieve it. DARPA, for instance, is a lean organisation with a relatively small R&D budget that produces big breakthroughs, famously the internet. And it does so by taking big risks. It has about a 15% success rate. big risks that tackle challenging national security problem sets. And the payoff from such a high-risk appetite goes beyond national security because it breaks barriers that the commercial world can then exploit, which it would be reluctant to tackle on its own. And we see this in the many breakthroughs, the innovations that have grown out of national security problem sets, often with dual applications, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones. There's a drone industry now being developed by the defence industry, or trying to encourage it, because to get off the China dependence, that's another story. Microgrids, GPS, internet, and so forth. An example of a problem set that is that you can relate to is the one that ended up as Siri on your iPhone, if you have one. That was a spin-off from a defence project in AI whose challenging problem set was to create a personalised assistant for the warfighter, one that could reason, reflect, and learn from experience, be told what to do, consider alternatives, and so on, and respond to surprise. Basically, act like a soldier's servant. And I think that was the name of the project, colonus, from the Latin colonus. So where am I going with this? Well, I'm certainly not suggesting that the military establishment is the only source of groundbreaking innovation. It isn't a question of either or, but of both public and private sectors working together in partnership. However problematic that has become. Even Google's achievements, from its digital library beginnings to its self-driving cars, and including its recent attainment of so-called quantum supremacy, were all very far from self-propelled achievements, as Google readily acknowledges. What I am proposing is that the influence that defence can and does exert over technological innovation is thanks not only to its the size of its R&D purse, its spending or its buying power, but also thanks to its appetite for risk and the national security problem sets that this sets in motion, providing the private sector with a stream of customised problem sets which then catalyse a demand for innovations that would otherwise not see the light of day. And of course I'd be interested to know whether David agrees with this at some point. Another limitation of relying on changes in R&D expenditure is that it overlooks the behavioural effects, the impact on the actor in question that we've been talking about, the effects of that spending shift on the defence-related agencies who are most concerned to harness the capabilities of the private sector. And here my research shows that instead of sidelining defence's role in innovation, the spending shift has acted as a kind of pressure for change, especially since the 90s. For example, it's motivated defence to create a raft of new incentives for procuring technology that would allow it to regain access and influence over commercial capabilities, which it has done by creating dual-use technology programs that incorporate dual use in the very design, as a carrot for public-private collaboration, offering private firms the promise of a commercial product at the end of the contract. And also by developing new organisational arrangements, venture capital entities, funds, cost-shared technology consortia, and so forth, all of which gives defence a means of exercising some influence over emerging technologies. So I don't see the structural changes as the end of a defence innovation story, a defence-led innovation story. My second set of comments relate more directly to why we shouldn't see the military as an insignificant force in the innovation fight against climate change. Of course, some speculative ideas here too. 3 reasons. First, the defence establishment relies on science and technology and evidence-based strategy. So it knows that climate change is real, and it has the freedom to say what it thinks about national security issues, regardless of who's in power. It's also produced a mountain of reports on climate change for at least 3 decades. So there's no question that it sees climate change as a threat multiplier, a far greater security risk than terrorism. The armed forces, to quote Michael Clare here, see the greatest threats from climate change being state collapse and mass migrations that are going to create chaos around the world. End of quote, making their job, of course, much more complex and difficult. Their recent reports depict a horribly grim future from climate change, involving blackouts, disease, thirst, starvation, and war. And the latest report found that the US military itself might be also at risk of collapsing. And all of this could happen over the next 2 decades. Which leads to my second point, that the military has a huge self-interest in safeguarding its own security, underlined by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where you see the tight nexus between security and oil convoys were easy targets for assault, and they lost a lot of people during those assaults. And that exposure led the military to push for green energy solutions, mobile solar technology, energy storage technologies. Even the US Navy became a green activist with its Great Green Fleet initiative, using algae-based biofuels and solar, promoted under Obama and of course flatlined under Trump. And because its domestic military bases are vulnerable to power outages from the national grid, hundreds and hundreds of outages, the military has developed a microgrid industry and is now the country's leader, producing 1/3 of US capacity, which in turn has boosted use of renewable fuel sources. But from ground zero, that hasn't been enough. In fact, the military, the bases in California, currently have renewable energy capacity far greater than their own needs. The military claims that it can contribute a very large part of the state's energy needs, and it wants to feed the surplus capacity into the main grid and gain income in return. So what's stopping it? In a word, politics. The State Assembly of California, the lower house, has put a cap on the military's renewable production. Which brings me to my third and final set of comments. If the defence establishment can't be a change agent, it would seem to have less to do with the size of its R&D wallet or its procurement market, and more to do with the political climate and the politics of climate change denial in the administration. Exactly the same in this country, where our own government looks very much like America's Siamese twin when it comes to marching in tune with its policy blunders. Of course, the defence sector may not be the single best place to conduct R&D for climate change, but given the current political realities, it's likely to be one of the few places where it's actually possible, at least in the US. And here, I want to end my comments by coming back to geopolitics, because here, geopolitics could trump domestic politics, no pun intended. Because what we see happening in the US, chiefly since 2015, is the emergence of a new peer adversary, a well-matched adversary on the scene, sparking a renewed strategic focus on innovation, on maintaining techno-superiority coming from the defence-related agencies, and in direct response to China's stated techno-military ambitions and actions. And so these are some of my thoughts on why I think it's perhaps too soon to discount the influential role of defence and the defence-related agencies in transformative innovation. So thank you.